Section 9 of the Arabian Nights Entertainments, Volume 4. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Beth Blakely. The Arabian Nights Entertainments, Volume 4. Translated by Jonathan Scott. Section 9. The Story of the Sisters Who Envied Their Younger Sister. Part 1. There was an emperor of Persia named Khusru Shah, who when he first came to his crown, in order to obtain a knowledge of affairs, took great pleasure in night adventures, attended by a trusty minister. He often walked in disguise through the city, and met with many adventures. After the ceremonies of his father's funeral rites and his own inauguration were over, the new sultan, as well from inclination as duty, went out one evening attended by his grand vizier, disguised like himself, to observe what was transacting in the city. As he was passing through a street in that part of the town inhabited only by the meaner sort, he heard some people talking very loud, and going close to the house whence the noise proceeded, and looking through a crack in the door, perceived a light and 3 sisters sitting on a sofa, conversing together after supper. By what the eldest said, he presently understood the subject of their conversation was wishes, for, she said, since we have got upon wishes, mine shall be to have the Sultan's baker for my husband, for then I shall eat my fill of that bread, which by way of excellence is called the Sultan's. Let us see if your tastes are as good as mine. For my part, replied the second sister, I wish I was wife to the Sultan's chief cook, for then I should eat of the most excellent dishes, and as I am persuaded that the Sultan's bread is common in the palace, I should not want any of that. Therefore you see, addressing herself to her elder sister, that I have a better taste than you. The youngest sister, who was very beautiful, and had more charms and wit than the 2 elders, spoke in her turn. For my part, sisters, said she, I shall not limit my desires to such trifles, but take a higher flight, and since we are upon wishing, I wish to be the emperor's queen consort. I would make him father of a prince, whose hair should be gold on one side of his head, and silver on the other. When he cried, the tears from his eyes should be pearl, and when he smiled, his vermilion lips should look like a rosebud fresh blown. The 3 sisters' wishes, particularly that of the youngest, seemed so singular to the Sultan that he resolved to gratify them in their desires, but without communicating his design to his grand vizier, he charged him only to take notice of the house, and bring the 3 sisters before him the following day. The grand vizier, in executing the emperor's orders, would but just give the sisters time to dress themselves to appear before him, without telling them the reason. He brought them to the palace, and presented them to the emperor, who said to them, Do you remember the wishes you expressed last night, when you were all in so pleasant a mood? Speak the truth. I must know what they were. At these unexpected words of the emperor, the 3 sisters were much confounded. They cast down their eyes and blushed, and the color which rose in the cheeks of the youngest quite captivated the emperor's heart. Modesty and fear lest they might have offended the emperor by their conversation kept them silent. The emperor, perceiving their confusion, said to encourage them, Fear nothing. I did not send for you to distress you, and since I see that is the effect of the question I asked, without my intending it, as I know the wish of each, I will relieve you from your fears. You, he added, who wish to be my wife, shall have your desire this day, and you, continued he, addressing himself to the 2 elder sisters, shall also be married to my chief baker and cook. As soon as the Sultan declared his pleasure, the youngest sister, setting her eldest an example, threw herself at the emperor's feet to express her gratitude. Sir, said she, my wish, since it has come to your majesty's knowledge, was expressed only in the way of conversation and amusement. I am unworthy of the honor you do me, and supplicate your pardon for my presumption. The 2 other sisters would have excused themselves also, but the emperor, interrupting them, said, No, no, it shall be as I have declared. Everyone's wish shall be fulfilled. The nuptials were all celebrated that day, as the emperor had resolved, but in a different manner. The youngest sisters were solemnized with all the rejoicings usual of the marriages of the emperors of Persia, and those of the 2 sisters according to the quality and distinction of their husbands, the one as the Sultan's chief baker, and the other as head cook. The 2 elder felt strongly the disproportion of their marriages to that of their younger sister. This consideration made them far from being content, though they were arrived at the utmost height of their late wishes, and much beyond their hopes. They gave themselves up to an excess of jealousy, which not only disturbed their joy, but was the cause of great troubles and afflictions to the queen consort their younger sister. They had not an opportunity to communicate their thoughts to each other on the preference the emperor had given her, but were altogether employed in preparing themselves for the celebration of their marriages. Some days afterwards, when they had an opportunity of seeing each other at the public baths, the eldest said to the other, Well, what say you to our sister's great fortune? Is not she a fine person to be queen? I must own, said the other sister, I cannot conceive what charms the emperor could discover to be so bewitched by the young gipsy. Was it a reason sufficient for him not to cast his eyes on you, because she was somewhat younger? You were as worthy of his bed, and in justice he ought to have preferred you. Sister, said the elder, I should not have regretted if his majesty had but pitched upon you, but that he should choose that hussy really grieves me. But I will revenge myself, and you, I think, are as much concerned as me. Therefore I propose that we should contrive measures, and act in concert in a common cause. Communicate to me what you think the likeliest way to mortify her, while I, on my side, will inform you what my desire of revenge shall suggest to me. After this wicked agreement, the two sisters saw each other frequently, and consulted how they might disturb and interrupt the happiness of the queen. They proposed a great many ways, but in deliberating about the manner of executing them, found so many difficulties that they durst not attempt them. In the meantime, they often went together to make her visits with a detestable dissimulation, and every time showed her all the marks of affection they could devise, to persuade her how overjoyed they were to have a sister raised to so high a fortune. The queen, on her part, constantly received them with all the demonstrations of esteem they could expect from a sister who was not puffed up with her high dignity, and loved them as cordially as before. Some months after her marriage, the queen found herself to be with child. The emperor expressed great joy, which was communicated to all the court, and spread throughout the empire of Persia. Upon this news the two sisters came to pay their compliments, and proffered their service to deliver her, desiring her, if not provided with a midwife, to accept of them. The queen said to them most obligingly, Sisters, I should desire nothing more, if it was absolutely in my power to make the choice. I am, however, obliged to you for your goodwill, but must submit to what the emperor shall order on this occasion. Let your husbands employ their friends to make interest, and get some courtier to ask this favor of his majesty. And if he speaks to me about it, be assured that I shall not only express the pleasure he does me, but thank him for making choice of you. The two husbands applied themselves to some courtiers their patrons, and begged of them to use their interest to procure their wives the honor they aspired to. Those patrons exerted themselves so much in their behalf that the emperor promised them to consider of the matter, and was as good as his word. For in conversation with the queen he told her that he thought her sisters were the most proper persons to assist her in her labor, but would not name them before he had asked her consent. The queen, sensible of the deference the emperor so obligingly paid her, said to him, Sir, I was prepared to do as your majesty might please to command, but since you have been so kind as to think of my sisters, I thank you for the regard you have shown them for my sake, and therefore I shall not dissemble that I had rather have them than strangers. The emperor named the queen's two sisters to be her midwives, and from that time they went frequently to the palace, overjoyed at the opportunity they should have of executing the detestable wickedness they had meditated against the queen. When the queen's time was up, she safely delivered of a young prince as bright as the day, but neither his innocence nor beauty could move the cruel hearts of the merciless sisters. They wrapped him up carelessly in his cloths, and put him into a basket, which they abandoned to the stream of a small canal that ran under the queen's apartment, and declared that she was delivered of a little dead dog which they produced. This disagreeable intelligence was announced to the emperor, who became so angry at the circumstance that he was likely to have occasioned the queen's death, if his grand vizier had not represented to him that he could not, without injustice, make her answerable for the caprices of nature. In the meantime, the basket in which the little prince was exposed was carried by the stream beyond a wall, which bounded the prospect of the queen's apartment, and from thence floated with the current down the gardens. By chance the intendant of the emperor's gardens, one of the principal and most considerable officers of the kingdom, was walking in the garden by the side of this canal, and perceiving a basket floating, called to a gardener who was not far off to bring it to shore, that he might see what it contained. The gardener, with a rake which he had in his hand, drew the basket to the side of the canal, took it up, and gave it to him. The intendant of the gardens was extremely surprised to see in the basket a child, which, though he knew it could be but just born, had very fine features. This officer had been married several years, but though he had always been desirous of having children, heaven had never blessed him with any. This accident interrupted his walk. He made the gardener follow him with the child, and when he came to his own house, which was situated at the entrance into the gardens of the palace, went into his wife's apartment. Wife, said he, as we have no children of our own, God has sent us one. I recommend him to you, provide him a nurse, and take as much care of him as if he were our own son, for from this moment I acknowledge him as such. The intendant's wife received the child with great joy, and took particular pleasure in the care of him. The intendant himself would not inquire too narrowly whence the child came. He saw plainly it came not far off the queen's apartment, but it was not his business to examine too closely into what had passed, nor to create disturbances in a place where peace was so necessary. The following year the queen consort was brought to bed of another prince, on whom the unnatural sisters had no more compassion than on his brother, but exposed him likewise in a basket, and set him adrift in the canal, pretending this time that the sultaness was delivered of a cat. It was happy also for this child that the intendant of the gardens was walking by the canal side, who had it carried to his wife, and charged her to take as much care of it as of the former, which was as agreeable to her inclination as it was to that of the intendant. The Emperor of Persia was more enraged this time against the queen than before, and she had felt the effects of his anger if the Grand Vizier's remonstrances had not prevailed. The third time the queen lay in, she was delivered of a princess, which innocent babe underwent the same fate as the princes her brothers. For the two sisters being determined not to desist from their detestable schemes, till they had seen the queen their younger sister at least cast off, turned out, and humbled, exposed this infant also on the canal. But the princess, as well as the two princes her brothers, was preserved from death by the compassion and charity of the intendant of the gardens. To this inhumanity the two sisters added a lie and deceit as before. They produced a piece of wood, and affirmed it to be a false birth of which the queen had been delivered. Khusru Shah could no longer contain himself. When he was informed of the new extraordinary birth, "What?" he said. "This woman, unworthy of my bed, will fill my palace with monsters if I let her live any longer. No, it shall not be. She is a monster herself, and I must rid the world of her." He pronounced sentence of death, and ordered the Grand Vizier to see it executed. The Grand Vizier and the courtiers who were present cast themselves at the Emperor's feet to beg of him to revoke the sentence. "Your Majesty, I hope, will give me leave," said the Grand Vizier, "to represent to you that the laws which condemn persons to death were made to punish crimes. The 3 extraordinary labors of the Queen are not crimes, for in what can she be said to have contributed towards them? Many other women have had, and have the same every day, and are to be pitied, but not punished. Your Majesty may abstain from seeing her, but let her live. The affliction in which she will spend the rest of her life after the loss of your favor will be a punishment sufficiently distressing." The Emperor of Persia considered with himself, and reflecting that it was unjust to condemn the queen to death for what had happened, said, "Let her live, then. I will spare her life. But it shall be on this condition, that she shall desire to die more than once every day. Let a wooden shed be built for her at the gate of the principal mosque, with iron bars to the windows, and let her be put into it in the coarsest habit, and every Mussulman that shall go into the mosque to prayers shall spit in her face. If anyone fail, I will have him exposed to the same punishment. And that I may be punctually obeyed, I charge you, Vizier, to appoint persons to see this done." The Emperor pronounced his sentence in such a tone that the Grand Vizier did not further remonstrate, and it was executed to the great satisfaction of the two envious sisters. A shed was built, and the queen, truly worthy of compassion, was put into it, and exposed ignominiously to the contempt of the people, which usage, as she did not deserve it, she bore with a patient resignation that excited the admiration as well as the compassion of those who judged of things better than the vulgar. The two princes and the princess were in the meantime nursed and brought up by the intendant of the gardens and his wife with all the tenderness of a father and a mother. And as they advanced in age, they all showed marks of superior dignity, but the princess in particular, which discovered itself every day by their docility and inclinations above trifles, different from those of common children, and by a certain air which could only belong to exalted birth. All this increased the affections of the intendant and his wife, who called the eldest Prince Bahman, and the second Perviz, both of them names of the most ancient emperors of Persia, and the princess Parizadeh, which name also had been borne by several queens and princesses of the kingdom. As soon as the two princes were old enough, the intendant provided proper masters to teach them to read and write, and the princess their sister, who was often with them, showing a great desire to learn, the intendant, pleased with her quickness, employed the same master to teach her also. Her emulation, vivacity, and piercing wit made her in a little time as great a proficient as her brothers. From that time the brothers and sister had the same masters in geography, poetry, history, and even the secret sciences, and made so wonderful a progress that their tutors were amazed, and frankly owned that they could teach them no farther. At the hours of recreation the princess learned to sing and play upon all sorts of instruments, and when the princes were learning to ride, she would not permit them to have an advantage over her, but went through all the exercises with them, learning to ride also, to bend the bow, and dart the reed or javelin, and oftentimes outdid them in the race, and other contests of agility. The intendant of the gardens was so overjoyed to find his adopted children so accomplished in all the perfections of body and mind, and that they so well requited the expense he had been at in their education, that he resolved to be at a still greater, for as he had till then been content only with his lodge at the entrance of the garden, and kept no country house, he purchased a country seat at a short distance from the city, surrounded by a large tract of arable land, meadows, and woods. As the house was not sufficiently handsome nor convenient, he pulled it down, and spared no expense in building a mansion more magnificent. He went every day to hasten by his presence the great number of workmen he employed, and as soon as there was an apartment ready to receive him, passed several days together there when his presence was not necessary at court, and by the same exertions the interior was furnished in the richest manner, answerably to the magnificence of the edifice. Afterwards he made gardens, according to a plan drawn by himself. He took in a large extent of ground, which he walled round and stocked with fallow deer, that the princes and princess might divert themselves with hunting when they chose. When this country seat was finished and fit for habitation, the intendant of the gardens went and cast himself at the emperor's feet, and after representing how long he had served, and the infirmities of age which he found growing upon him, begged he would permit him to resign his charge into his majesty's disposal and retire. The emperor gave him leave, with the more pleasure because he was satisfied with his long services, both in his father's reign and his own, and when he granted it, asked what he should do to recompense him. "Sir," replied the intendant of the gardens, "I have received so many obligations from your majesty and the late emperor your father of happy memory, that I desire no more than the honor of dying in your favor." He took his leave of the emperor and retired with the 2 princes and the princess to the country retreat he had built. His wife had been dead some years, and he himself had not lived above 6 months with them before he was surprised by so sudden a death, that he had not time to give them the least account of the manner in which he had discovered them. The Princes Bahman and Perviz, and the Princess Parizadeh, who knew no other father than the intendant of the emperor's gardens, regretted and bewailed him as such, and paid all the honors in his funeral obsequies which love and filial gratitude required of them. Satisfied with the plentiful fortune he had left them, they lived together in perfect union, free from the ambition of distinguishing themselves at court, or aspiring to places of honor and dignity which they might easily have obtained. End of Section 9. Recording by Beth Blakely.